the prince, the president, the chairman, the boss. Every political system has some form of concentrated executive power, someone or some group that can act decisively, bypass normal processes, force change when institutions are gridlocked. Machiavelli devoted most of The Prince to this question. What can a ruler do? What should a ruler do? What are the limits of executive action? Today we formalize the executive sector. How does executive power accumulate and deplete? When can it override normal dynamics? And what are the consequences? Executive power, our variable E, represents the ruler's capacity to force outcomes. This isn't formal authority alone. It's effective power, the combination of legitimacy, resources, loyal supporters, institutional control, and personal skill that lets a ruler actually accomplish things. E is a stock that accumulates and depletes. A new leader might start with high E from electoral mandate or revolutionary success. Over time, E can grow or shrink depending on performance and circumstances. What fills the E stock? Success, solving crises, delivering prosperity, winning conflicts, appearing competent and legitimate. What drains the E stock? Failure, botched responses, economic decline, lost conflicts, appearing incompetent or illegitimate, and critically, using power. Every time the executive forces an outcome, E depletes somewhat. The ruler spends political capital. The executive can act as a forcing function on other variables. Normally, L moves slowly through legislative processes, but an executive with sufficient E can force L to move quickly. Decrees, emergency powers, executive orders. Bypass the normal system. Normally, C follows its own dynamics, but an executive can suppress conflict through force, cooptation, or propaganda, or deliberately stoke conflict for political purposes. Normally, N evolves slowly, but an executive can shore up norms through enforcement and rhetoric, or deliberately erode norms to expand freedom of action. The executive isn't bound by the normal equations. That's the point. Concentrated power exists precisely to override distributed processes when necessary. But there are costs. Every forced outcome costs executive power. Push L against resistance, and you spend E. The further you push, the more you spend. The stronger the resistance, the more you spend. Suppress conflict, and you spend E. Maintain suppression, and you keep spending. Stop spending, and suppressed conflict rebounds. Override norms, and you spend E. Sometimes you also erode your own legitimacy, reducing future E regeneration. The equation looks something like DEDT, regeneration, success, legitimacy, expenditure forcing, decay, time. E regenerates based on perceived success. E depletes based on forcing actions. E also decays naturally over time as circumstances change and memories fade. The key insight: forcing is expensive. You can do it, but not forever, not for free. Executive power creates feedback cycles. Virtuous cycle. The ruler succeeds, E grows. More E enables more success. Success generates more E. The ruler becomes stronger. Vicious cycle. The ruler fails, E shrinks. Less E means less ability to act. Inability leads to more failures. Failures deplete E further. The ruler becomes weaker. These cycles can be self-reinforcing. Strong executives tend to get stronger until they overreach. Weak executives tend to get weaker until they fall. The tipping point is when regeneration can no longer keep up with depletion. At that point, the vicious cycle takes over. The ruler can't stop the decline. This explains why political falls often accelerate. Things seem stable, then suddenly collapse. The underlying E erosion was happening, but wasn't visible until it crossed a threshold. Machiavelli identified several executive strategies. We can formalize them. Force. Suppress conflict directly through violence or coercion. High short-term effectiveness, high E cost, erodes legitimacy and norms. Cooptation. buy off opposition through patronage and redistribution. Moderate E cost, but requires ongoing expenditure, creates dependencies. Legitimation, build support through ideology, propaganda, or genuine performance. Low E cost, once established, but slow to build. Division, split opposition, so they fight each other. Can be cheap in E, but risks losing control and often erodes norms. The optimal strategy depends on circumstances. High E rulers can afford force. Low E rulers must use legitimation. Skilled rulers combine strategies. Different parameter values in the model represent different strategic orientations. Delta, executive effectiveness, captures how efficiently the ruler converts E into outcomes. Institutions can constrain executive power. In some systems, the executive is checked by legislature, judiciary, military, or other centers of power. These checks limit what E can accomplish. They also limit how much E can deplete before triggering intervention. In other systems, the executive is unconstrained. E can accomplish more, but can also deplete more. Unconstrained executives tend to cycle between domination and collapse. We can model institutional constraints as bounds on executive action. The executive can only force L so far, can only suppress C so much. Beyond those bounds, forcing becomes impossible or triggers backlash. Strong institutions narrow the bounds. Weak institutions widen them. The width of the bounds affects system dynamics significantly. Executive power doesn't transfer smoothly. When a ruler falls or leaves, E doesn't simply pass to the successor. The new ruler starts with their own E level, often much lower than the predecessor. This creates succession crises. The system was stable under high E. Suddenly, E drops. Suppressed conflicts resurface. Forced equilibria become unstable. The model can capture this as a sudden drop in E. What happens to the other variables? Does the system adjust smoothly to new equilibrium? Or does it tip into instability? Much of political history is succession dynamics. Empires fall not when the emperor dies, but when no successor can maintain control. Regimes collapse not when the leader weakens, but when no replacement emerges. Here's your challenge. For your chosen political economy, assess the executive sector. What's the current E level? High, medium, low? How is E being used? Forcing policy, suppressing conflict, shoring up norms? What's the regeneration rate? Is the ruler succeeding, maintaining legitimacy? What's the depletion rate? How much is being spent on forcing? Is the cycle virtuous or vicious, strengthening or weakening? What would a succession look like? How much E would the next leader have? Next episode: Economic considerations. How does production interact with politics? See you then.